when connecting to the lost, thou shalt keep it simple. Thou shalt keep it simple. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 1 through 4, Paul keeps it simple. He says, I make known to you, brethren, the gospel that I preached unto you, which also you received, by which also you stand, which also you are saved, if you hold fast the word I preached to you, unless if you believed in vain. And here it is, for I delivered unto you as of first importance, that Christ Jesus died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and he was raised again according to the third day in the Scriptures. The gospel's simple. We complicate it. It's the good news of the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus Christ. It doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. When we're with somebody who's lost, you can talk about 1,000 other things. You could say, well, you know, the Bible says that Adam had a belly button or something. You can go ahead and argue whatever you want to argue. But the point is, first importance is first in simplicity. The message we should always be talking about is the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus Christ when we're around the lost. I want to tell you a story about the conversion of Jesse Sherwood. I used to work for MCI, the long distance company, for a couple years, and Jesse was about, I think he was like 19 at the time, little tiny frail guy, and he always talked like this, and he would make his calls. Well, he wasn't doing that well on the job, and so they put me next to him for a period of about a month so he could learn a better work ethic. And during that time, you're sitting next to somebody 8 hours a day. During off time, you're going to talk. And eventually, he ended up coming to church. But I would always talk about the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus Christ. Death, burial, resurrection of Jesus Christ. And what happened was he came to church one Sunday morning, and we had a fellowship meal at the park afterwards. And he got to meet some of the people from the church, and then he came to the meal afterwards, and we were talking some more, and after that, and he, I remember I got down to the explaining the particulars of the gospel, how we fulfill it, and he says, right before that, he says, wait a second, are you saying that I got to be nailed to a cross and then die? I said, no, Jesus already did that. That's so that you can be forgiven if you so choose to be forgiven. Well, he revealed to me at that time, he felt vulnerable. He revealed to me that he was dying of AIDS. He was only 19 years of age. I noticed that he had some sores that pop up on his neck and stuff at work every now and then. But the backstory behind it was that his dad died of a lithium overdose when he was age 14. His mom, very much a reprobate, she just kicked him out of the house, and he ended up being taken in by a group of immoral people. And over the next couple of years, they had their way with him, and now he had AIDS. And he wanted to be baptized. He went back later that night to the evening service. And Jesse was baptized into Christ. He wanted to be forgiven of all his sins. He wanted to go to heaven. You know, the next day at work, he didn't show up, though. He didn't show up the next day or the next day. And I didn't, just before cell phones, I didn't know who to call. And finally, after the fourth day, my preacher called me and said, hey, I found out where Jesse is. And I said, where is he? He's up in the hospital. And he began to decline in health quite a bit. And I remember I went up to see Jesse in the hospital, and he was dying. And I remember him saying, I said, well, Jesse, what do you think about what happened on Sunday? He said, it's good knowing that I'm going to heaven. One less thing. He died 3 weeks after he was baptized. What would have happened if I would have overly complicated it? What would have happened if I would have said, well, you know, the Levitical sacrificial system approach to this, you know, the stuff I give you isn't exactly what I would give somebody who's lost. You know, there's one more soul. You know, he was buried in an unmarked grave with a class of 1988 bodies that were researched for science. It's an Oakland cemetery. Just another set of cremains in a batch buried in there. But you know what? God will remember him. God knows who he is. And thou shalt keep it simple. Thou shalt generously scatter the seed. Thou shalt generously scatter the seed. Acts 17, 32 to 34. Paul, he was up on the Areopagus in Mars Hill. Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some began to snare. Others said, we shall hear you again concerning this. So Paul went out of their midst, but some joined them and believed, among whom were Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. There were various souls in the marketplace that day. And as Paul was at the temple of Hephaestus down by the marketplace, he had the commoner people. He had a lot of foreigners there. He went up and talked with the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers, and he was able to generously scatter that seed all the way up that 75-foot high hill. And there it had a payday. Some fell among, Paul says, I, Paul, planted, Apollos watered, but God giveth the increase. He scattered a big bag of seed. Some fell among thorny soil. Some fell among rocky places. Others fell on good soil. Our job is to scatter the seed, which is the Word of God. Stop worrying about, will they respond? Will they respond? Stay tuned. Join next week. Stop it. Our job is to scatter the seed. And that seed is the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus Christ. We are farmers for God. Yeah, we're fishers of men, but we're also farmers. And so I want to tell you about the conversion of John Johnson and Jim Hutchins. John Johnson, he was a man who struggled with alcoholism. And I remember I was teaching a class. I got into a whole batch of AA individuals, and I went off on personal studies with them. John was one of them. And I was studying with John the gospel one day. It was just at his place alone, but a friend came by. His name was Jim Hutchins. And Jim Hutchins just sat there. I mean, he looked like a motorcyclist. He had the big beard and the jacket and everything. And all he did was introduce himself, and he sat as I'm sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ for conversion for John Johnson. And what happened was, I get down to the end of the presentation. Now, Jim didn't say another word. He's just sitting there watching. Now, Jim had been in prison for like 9 years. I mean, he had a hard past. He also had a cycle of addiction as well. And so John, I was trying to get John to respond to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And John was just kind of dragging his feet. And I said, why tarriest thou? You know, and I kept asking corner. And then what happened was, John says, well, I just have to think about it. And then Jim, the next thing he said after hello was, I said, well, I need to get going back to the church right now. And Jim got up and started following me. And Jim said, well, he may reject salvation, but I'm going to get it. And then we're walking out. Jim wanted to be baptized into Christ after hearing the gospel. And then before we left, John says, you're not the only one who's going to heaven. And he joined, so we had a double baptism at that time. There's plenty of seed to go around. You're not going to run out of seed. Never, ever. God made it to where, like that meal during the days of Elijah, That thing is always going to fill up. There's plenty of seed. Cast it. Thou shalt generously scatter the seed. Here's another one. Thou shalt love their potential. Love them for not who they are, but for who they can become in Christ. People who cannot read books can read people. Loving someone's potential in Christ is the most sincere form of love that the Christian can exhibit in evangelism. Like in Acts chapter 18, 24 through 26, Apollos, Alexandrian by birth, eloquent man, came to Ephesus, mighty in the Scriptures. He was instructed in the way of the Lord, being fervent in spirit, speaking and teaching accurately the things concerning Jesus, being only acquainted with the baptism of John. One problem, he was teaching the wrong baptism. John the Baptist had been dead for like some 21 years by then. He was still under the old baptism. And what did Priscilla and Aquila do? They didn't yell at him. They didn't say anything. They saw the potential, and they took him aside and explained to him a way of God more accurately. And guess where they, after they baptized Apollos, they sent him to Corinth because he was the perfect tool to face off with the rabid Jew culture that was going on in there that was persecuting the Christians. Apollos was a very competent man, but he was loved because of his potential. I want to tell you about Gene the plumber. Gene was a guy that I met about 20-some years ago. We were playing euchre together. That's a trump game. I went up to the American Legion every Saturday in the wintertime. They had a euchre tournament, and I went to go. I didn't have a partner. Gene didn't have a partner. They put us two together, and that's how I met him. And we were playing euchre for a few hours. It's a very fun trump game, and what happened was, what happened in this case is that I noticed Gene had a little tremor in his hand as he held the cards. And we were just talking. The next week I went up, I chose Gene and Gene chose me. And we got to know each other over about 12 weeks. Meanwhile, back at the church, I invited him to come to church. He did. And he started coming to church. Now, I wasn't even the preacher, but I was a Christian who had a friend named Gene the plumber. He was a retired plumber, and Gene started coming to church, and then I started inviting him to certain things away from the church building with other people. Gene became the official non-member plumber of our congregation. You had a plumbing need, you called Gene. He had a purpose. He had no family whatsoever. Nothing. The church was his family, but he was yet to be converted. And what happened was, I knew his birthday was coming up, and he told me that he never had a birthday party. Here he is, 72 years old, never had a birthday party his whole life. He had grown up during the Depression. He was a very poor family, not a very loving family. And so here's what we did at the church. We tricked Gene. Downstairs in the preacher's house, of a split-level foyer house, we had like 30 members of the church. It was all decorated up. It was just absolutely beautiful. Party hats, gifts, and everything. And then Kurt DeBoer, the preacher, called up Gene and said, "Gene, come quick, there's water everywhere." And he hangs up. And Gene shows up 10 minutes later, and he has his little plumbing kit. And he walks by, and he goes downstairs, and he walks by all these people to his left. And what happened was he didn't even notice that there's 30 people dressed up for a birthday party. And he walks in, and he looks around, and he says, "What's this?" We said, "Happy birthday!" And he broke down crying. It took 72 years to have his first birthday party. You know, the next week I invited Gene over to my place for some steaks afterwards, had a couple brothers with me, and I said, "Hey, I want to do the friend-brother procedure." And they said, "What's that?" I said, "You and me, we're brothers. We always refer to each other as brothers. Gene is our friend. Refer to him as friend. That's all." So we were sitting around the table talking. I said, Hey, Brother Downey, what about this? And I don't know, Brother Doug. Well, how about you, Brother Zach? Well, I don't know, Brother Doug. Friend, what do you think? And this just kept going on and on and on. And finally, after about 30 minutes of it, Gene goes, boom, and he hits the table and said, why do you call them brothers and you call me friend? And I said, because they're my brothers, friend. That's okay, though. If you want to be a brother, well, you know what to do. He said, well, that's it. I want the name brother. And he went down to the church and he was baptized into Christ. You know, I left to go to preaching school a year later, and I didn't get to see Gene much anymore. He ended up going to a nursing home, but he loved serving on the table. And one of the biggest frustrations he had was when he couldn't hold the tray anymore. He was just shaking too much. But Gene died a faithful member of the church at Lantern Park Nursing Home. You see, thou shalt love their potential. Because I could see the beauty in Gene as a Christian. I loved his potential, where it might have been easy to give up. Thou shalt keep it Christocentric. 1 Corinthians 2, verse 2, Paul says, for I determined to know nothing among you but Christ and him crucified. What about this? Know nothing among you but Christ and him crucified. 1 Corinthians 1, 12 through 17, Paul says, now I mean this, that each of you are saying, I am of Paul, and I am of Apollos, and I am of Cephas, and I am of Christ. Has Christ been divided? Paul was not crucified for you, was he? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, that no one would say you were baptized in my name. For Christ did not call me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not in cleverness of speech, so that the cross of Christ might not be made void. Paul's saying you got to keep it centered around Christ. Around Christ. That's what everything is. We have a tendency to attempt conversion to the church instead of conversion to Christ. Well, you know, you should join our team. No, you have to become a Christian. That's what the goal is. Become a Christian. Christ adds us to the body. Whenever anybody is baptized, that is not the act of a man adding someone to the church. It's the act of that man tying into covenant with Jesus, and Jesus adds them to the church. None of these topics can save a soul. Only the gospel of Christ can. One time on one of the trips to India, it was in the evening, a bunch of denominational preachers came out to our gospel meeting. And when I saw them there, I thought, you know, they started saying, well, what do you feel about this? And what do you feel about that? One saved always said, well, you know, how come you don't sprinkle? How come you don't this? And so I laser focused on Christ, and I was not going to go more than a quarter inch from that cross. Everything, death, burial, resurrection, everything, death, burial, resurrection. And by the end of that meeting that we had, 8 of those denominational preachers were baptized into Christ. And 4 of them went back and converted nearly their entire church. Because it was kept Christocentric. Thou shalt become all things for all people. Thou shalt become all things for all people. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 9, 20 through 23, to the Jew I became as a Jew, so that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, though myself not being under the law, but so that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, though not being without the law of God, but being under the law of Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I become weak, I do all things for all men, that by all means I might save some. I do all for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it. Have you ever noticed that Jesus had a ministry where he went mostly to the people? They didn't so come to him. He traveled. He moved. He met fishermen, farmers, shepherds in their natural environment. We must never compromise on the message. We must compromise on the method. The method is the glue that allows it to stick to the heart. Over and over again, Jesus, you want to know why he's using parable of farming, planting, harvesting, and then he'd do fishermen, and then he'd do shepherds and stuff. He was speaking their language. He was becoming all things for all men, that by all means he might save some. I want to tell you the story about Raul and the car ministry. Raul was one of our members' spouses. He didn't darken the doorway of the church. He worked picking up cars at auction and would bring them to the dealership so they can clean them up and sell them. And his wife came and says, is there any way we could try to lead my husband to Christ? I said, yeah, you bet. So here's what I did. I decided to start a car repair ministry. And I teamed up with Raul. He'd take me to the auction. Sometimes the car would be more to fix than it would be to buy a different one. We'd just buy a different one. And so Raul, I'd end up riding with him on Monday nights to the car auction, and then I'd spend time with him, and then we would be talking, and you got to spend time with people. And so what happened was Raul, I invited him into the car ministry. I said, hey, listen, you're already helping. You might as well, you're part of the car ministry already. And he said, well, I never thought about that. But then we had small home group Bible studies. He started coming to a couple of those Bible studies. Then when that 6-week study ended, he said to his wife, he really enjoyed going to the small home group Bible study. And the next study, he asked, is it possible we could have one at my place? Because I get off of work and it's kind of like, no problem. What would you like to cover? He said that, and that's where we had it. 2 weeks later, had the study starting at his place. Raul was baptized into Christ, and he became one of the most faithful goers. If you wanted to see who was waiting at the door to get in, it was Raul and his wife, Drew. I was so glad that happened because he was a kidney transplant and recipient, and as his body began to fail, then he was going into liver failure. He kept having a positive attitude, And we prayed and prayed for him, and they were going to unhook the machine. He was breathing on a respirator. The whole church was gathered around. We had at least 20 people in that room with his wife, Drew. And they went to unhook it. He wanted to be surrounded by Christians when he died. And you know what? A half hour went by, and he looked at us. He says, bummer, I'm still here. That's what he said. He died 2 days later. Took his body that long to shut down. I thought he was even going to make a comeback. He likely wouldn't. But you become all things for all people, so that by all means you might save some. Make the adjustment. Thou shalt not prejudge. Thou shalt not prejudge. John 4, 7 through 30, Jesus and the disciples were traveling from Galilee to Jerusalem. And they didn't take the normal route of crossing the Jordan, going up through Perea and back. They went right through Samaria. And Samaria was a half-breed cousins of the Jews. And boy, those Jews, they were racist against them, and so were the Samaritans against the Jews. And so Jesus went straight through Samaria and encountered a reprobate woman with a past. And while the disciples went for food, Jesus brought a message to the Samaritan woman at the well. By the time the encounter was over, she was bringing the entire town out to meet Jesus. And this came to fruition later on in Acts chapter 8. When Philip brought the gospel to the same region later, they were already primed. And there were many thousands of conversions that occurred at that point. We must not prejudge. You know, on one of the trips to Romania, I met a woman named Minadora, and Minadora had a granddaughter that had died. I went over and visited with her and comforted her at that point, and they were absolute and utter poverty. And but I shared the gospel with her and the whole family. And on the next trip I went, I mean, she was so poor, but she wanted to give me some kind of gift before I go. And so when I came back on the next trip, like 9 months later, I brought something for her, and when I got off the plane, I gave the address, went over to Minadora and Robert and Gabriella's home, little tiny apartment, and I went in, I said, here's a gift for you, and I just wanted to let you know that I'm in town. And she's gypsy. She's gypsy, and let me tell you, gypsy in these former Slavic countries, they have a horrible reputation. And they've earned it. But you can't label everybody a gypsy. She was baptized into Christ. So was her daughter Gabriella. Robert was already converted, the son. But imagine what would happen if I would have said, no, I'm not going to go to this part of the ghetto. I'm not going to go to a gypsy's apartment building. It was tempting not to do that. A lot of crime there. But I went anyway because one of our members was in that house. Now there's 3 of those members in that house. Never prejudge. Thou shalt not change the message. Thou shalt not change the message. Paul says in Galatians 1, 8, and 9, though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel unto you than that which we have preached unto you, let him be accursed. As I say once, so I now say again, if any man preaches any other gospel unto you than that which you have received, let him be accursed. There is a constant pull of the world and denominational influence to pull us from that true gospel of Christ. If there's one thing that we must draw the line on, is that the gospel is the power of God to salvation, Romans 1:16. The New Testament message of the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus Christ cannot be diminished. In fact, if you even put that in the background, if you're ashamed, are you ashamed of that? Are you afraid that your friends are going to say, oh, come on, dude, somebody coming back from the dead? Well, that's on your faith at that point. Then we need to have some lessons to prove the historicity of Jesus. Because the bottom line is this, it is a fact of history. There was someone named Jesus. He became the Christ when he was dead, buried, and resurrected on that 3rd day. Fact of history. And that is the big fact of history. And we must not change that in the slightest bit. We must not do it. I want to tell you about this guy named Gene. Gene was, he responded to the invitation on the midweek service in a church in Iowa, and he came up drunk. He was drunk. I never saw the guy before, and when I offered the invitation, he goes like this, walks up. I think, oh, here we go. And woo, he smelled like alcohol. I said, what can I do for you? Now they're still singing. He says, I don't want to be baptized. I said, okay. Well, let me check. And I said to him, so why do you want to be baptized? Well, because you said that I need to be baptized. I said, well, we need to study. We need to study, and you need to sober up. And so we set the study. I announced to them, Gene is going to have a Bible study with me. We studied a couple times. He was ready to be baptized, he said. And here's what happened. He was well known, I found out, for womanizing and being a drunkard. And I asked him right before we were going to set the time for baptism, I said, Gene, what are you be most happy to be forgiven of? What are you be most happy? He said, oh, that womanizing I've been doing and that drinking. He says, I need to be forgiven of that. I said, awesome. Okay, well, we'll meet you out here at the church at, say, about 4 o'clock. And I said, oh, by the way, don't ask Christ to forgive you of something you have no intention of giving up. That's a good standard rule. And because the Bible is very clear. What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? For heaven's sake, no. How shall we who died to sin live any longer therein? Know ye not as many as you were baptized into Christ have been clothed in Christ? You got to get that straight before the baptism. Well, I get out there, and Gene, he didn't show up. Waited another hour, didn't show up. He stood me at the altar. So I thought, well, it's a small town, 4,500, I'll see him somewhere. Sure enough, 2 days later, in front of Casey's General Store, there was his little pickup truck. And I went into the Casey's General, looked around, I saw his head ducked behind this ATM machine. I said, Gene, is that you? He goes, oh yeah, I was just checking the ATM. I said, dude, why'd you leave me at the altar? I was waiting there stuff, and he said, well, I got to think about what you said. I wasn't really willing to give that up yet. I said, well, that's okay. I'd rather you be an honest heathen than a hypocritical Christian any day. I said, that's fine, just as long as you know when you're ready. Just let me know. I said, okay. I said, okay, friend, take care. Well, about a week later, I get a call at the church building. It's Gene. Man, is he mad? He said, are you there? Yeah. He said, man, you wait right there. I'm glad I was bigger than him. I didn't know I was going to happen. And he came in, he was fuming mad. I said, what is wrong with you, man? He says, well, I was sitting in the bar the other night, reflection in the mirror, looking at it, thinking about going to have my old lifestyle, and it just hit me. You're going to choose hell over this? I said, does that mean you're willing to give those things up because you want to be forgiven of those things? He said, yes. Okay, now you're ready. He was baptized into Christ. You see, don't change the message. Don't back down for a second. That's a satanic move when we do that. We have to make sure we keep the same message. Thou shalt not be a lone evangelist. Thou shalt not be a lone evangelist. Paul says, I, Paul, planted, Apollos watered, but God giveth the increase. Philippians 4, verse 3. Indeed, true comrade, I urge also that you help these women who share my struggle in the cause of the gospel, together with Clement also and the rest of my fellow brethren. You know, the average person who converts to Christ, did you know they have 5 relationships with others in church? 5. Some people specialize in teaching, some in service, some in compassion, some in organization, some in giving, some in shepherding, missions, yes, some in evangelism. 1 Peter 4 verse 10 says, as each one has received a special gift, employ it in serving one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. It's called teamwork. It's called teamwork. Behind every soul who's converted, don't ever make the mistake of the lone evangelist. The power is in the team. I want to tell you about Tracy the techie. He was a young man that we had this Friday night thing going in Pennsylvania where we'd have movie night. It was called Nick at Night. The Nicks were a family in our church. And the next door neighbor was Tracy. Tracy's like one of these incredibly smart people. I I mean, he met his wife at a Mensa retreat. And he's just incredibly smart. Well, he was coming to the Nick's place, and then there were other people who met him at the Nick's place, and they would invite him to certain things. It wasn't long before he was going to church and everything. And then he was attending small home group Bible studies, and lo and behold, at the end of one of the small home group Bible studies, gospel rehabilitation therapy, he said, "Oh, I want to be baptized." He had thought about it. This went on for more than a year. He was connected to at least 40 people in our congregation, at least 40 of them. When we would have something that required planning, even beforehand, we put our visitors to work. Well, Tracy, you're really good with the computer. He was helping do a whole bunch of things. Don't be a lone evangelist. We got a team. Who can say you've been put in Junction City Church of Christ for such a time as this? Esther 4:14. Thou shalt not be ashamed. Thou shalt not be ashamed. I quoted earlier, Paul says in 1:16 of Romans, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. For in it is the power of God to salvation." Dunamis, where we get the word dynamite. Power of God to salvation. 2 Timothy 1 verse 8, "Do not be ashamed of the testimony of our Lord or of me his prisoner, but join with me in suffering for the gospel according to the power of God." Acts 17 verse 18, when the Epicurean Stoic philosophers said to Paul, "What would this idle babbler have to say?" Paul didn't back down. Paul launched a full double-barrel gospel presentation at them. Splattered salvation everywhere. In the secular world, such as ours, it can be tempting to talk about someone named Jesus rising from the dead. It can be tempting to not talk about that. Sometimes we won't because it might not be cool with the people that we're hanging around with. We could easily be shamed by humanists in the culture. Do not be silenced or shamed. Jesus' tomb is just as empty today as it was 2,000 years ago. Is the tomb still empty? Yeah. Okay, it's empty. Nothing's going to change that. The tomb is empty. We will not be ashamed. Stop cowering to the humanist. Be equipped. Be like Clint Eastwood with a Bible. And when they say, "You believe in death, burial, resurrection from the dead?" we open that Bible up and say, "Go ahead, make my day." And we give them the gospel of Jesus Christ. Do not back down. Be strong and courageous, Joshua said over and over again. I want to tell you about Dr. Horia. Dr. Horia, before I was a preacher, I used to teach Sunday evenings in Iowa City. And I was in the book of the Kings, I believe it was 2 Kings. And this guy showed up, Dr. Horia. I didn't know who he was. He walks in as I'm reciting all the kings of Israel, then all the kings of Judah to show the pattern on the chalkboard and the things that, and he just came in. I said, "Go ahead, have a seat." And then what happened was he said after that he was from Romania. He fled in the brain drain of '89 after Ceausescu died. He was working on his second PhD at the University of Iowa. His family was off in California. He was the son of a Romanian or grandson of a Romanian Orthodox priest. And he was just walking. He heard the word being preached, and he came in. And he continued to go to studies. His wife and 2 kids, he just came out to University of Iowa to do his mathematics PhD. He already had the chemistry. And so he kept coming to church, kept studying. And then what happened was, we always had prayer requests after church, and his wife was going to have a biopsy. They thought she might have breast cancer. And this was so distraught because he was 1,500 miles away. He couldn't get back. It weighed on his heart. He had no family there. Now, it'd be intimidating. You have a PhD professor working on another PhD. It'd be temple. Well, no, gospel's no. Boom. Gospel's powerful. Gospel is, we just have to be sharp and confident in what we share with them. And you know what? He was. He liked the fact that we held the Bible up as the only Word of God. It felt safe in a strange world. And we weren't just basing things on an existential faith thing. Oh, can you say Jesus? No, we back it up. We think good, and then we'd feel good about the thoughts in the Bible. Well, he requested prayer for his wife. And as they waited for the biopsy to come back, our whole prayer, with Horia there, we prayed for his wife, turned it over to Christ. The next day, he found out that his wife did not have cancer. He was so grateful to God that we had another prayer the following week, a prayer of thanks. Horia wanted to be part of the family of God. He said, I want to be baptized into Christ. And then after he got his PhD, he went out to California, where he led his wife to Christ and his 2 daughters to Christ. You see, thou shalt not be ashamed. We have nothing to be ashamed of. If we're walking with Christ, we have nothing to be ashamed of. The last one is, thou shalt not give up. Thou shalt not give up. 1 Corinthians 1:16, Paul says, for if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of. For woe is me if I do not preach the gospel of Christ. Evangelism tends to be a long game and not a short game. Our goal is not to rush them into the water, but to introduce them to Jesus from the Bible. It'd be great if everyone made that decision after one gospel presentation, but this is unrealistic. Most conversions that I've been involved with in the past take weeks, months, and even years of labor. And we must never give up on somebody until they give up on that opportunity. We must keep on keeping on. And with that, I'll close with this story. You know, I was baptized in June of 1988. Went to preacher school in 1997. You know, I had shared the gospel of Christ with my mom multiple times. She's watching right now. You're not going to hide, Mom. You know, and she'll tell you how many times that came up. If she had ever, you know, I would look for those opportunities, and she'd bring something up, and I say, hey, what do you think about that death, burial, resurrection of Christ? What do you think about that? If you died today, Mom, do you know absolutely, positively, without a shadow of a doubt, you'd go to heaven? Must have asked her that 6 times over the years. A couple times she cried. Remember that, Mom? Boo-hoo-hoo, you were crying. You're a bad son. No, you never thought that. But the point is, I kept sharing the gospel with her. She sold her last bar and restaurant back in about 6 years ago. And the last one of the gospel presentations, I said, Mom, why wouldn't you be baptized? She said, because I don't feel right running a bar. I can't run a bar, and I understand that. I do. But she had sold the last bar. She came out for the Super Bowl party. It'll be 6 years ago this January. We were leaving the Super Bowl party at the Forkners, and on the way back, mom, who was out visiting in Pennsylvania, said, "Do you think maybe I could be baptized?" Now, it was cold. I mean, it was cold. And the heater was broken in the baptismal. But we went down to the church, and she was baptized into Christ. My own mom. Who are you willing to give up on? So the Ten Commandments are simple. The Ten Commandments of Evangelism are simple. Thou shalt keep it simple. Thou shalt generously scatter the seed. Thou shalt love their potential. Thou shalt keep it Christocentric. Thou shalt become all things for all people. And then you have the nots. Thou shalt not prejudge. Thou shalt not change the message. Thou shalt not be a lone evangelist. Thou shalt not be ashamed. Thou shalt not give up. These are the Ten Commandments of Evangelism.